I don't want to scare you guys, but it is the truth, and I'm here to tell you the truth of what I experienced. Honestly, I can't believe it's happening. Like, it's finally happening. It's been, what, 4? Almost 5 years? I'm finally filming this video. Minasan konnichiwa, Ari desu. Hi guys, my name is Ali. Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm finally filming one of the most anticipated videos of my channel, how I read my first book in Japanese. It's right here. I'm gonna tell you everything about the method I used, how long it took me, what were the phases I went through, because I definitely went through a lot of phases during that first reading. And I'm also going to answer some of your questions, guys, related to the start of my reading journey in particular, and also reading that first book in particular. So let's go. This is a long overdue video because I'm currently at 139 books read in Japanese, so it took me a while, but we're finally talking about it, so I hope you're excited. Maybe we should start about the facts first, because I think it's important, and I have my beautiful Dokusho Noto here, which I used to log the first 50 books I have read in Japanese. So I have everything in there, and the first page is dedicated to the first book I read in Japanese. What a surprise! And so it was Kimi no Na wa by Shinkai Makoto, and I read it from the 25th of October 2019 all the way through the 31st of January 2020. So it's been 4.5 years since I've read this book. By the way, guys, I'm actually filming this video like over a few days, not on the same day, so that's why you'll see me looking different pretty much in every clip. And also I needed to actually collect my thoughts a little bit about the topic, because to be honest, it's been a while. As I just told you in the last clip, it's been 4.5 years, so I definitely needed to refresh my memory. And to do that, I even read my own Instagram post from the 9th of June 2021. Even the post itself is very old now. So yeah, I had to read that as well just to refresh my memory. Now it's very fresh in my mind. Also, again, before we start, I had touched on this a little bit in the first video of this series, when I told you guys that at the time my main goal with learning Japanese was to be able to read books. Even today, it is still one of the biggest drives I have with the language. I just want you to keep all of that in mind while I dive deeper into my own explanations. Just keep that front of mind, because I think it is the most important takeaway of this video. And now on that good note, let's start. Alright, so starting with the first question, which is actually a collection of different questions about the same topic. Have you given up on some books too difficult at the beginning, or did you always push to finish them? And then other people also asked whether I dropped books. I think it's a great first question because it really introduces the topic of how I read my first book. Before I read my first book, it's important to also note that I had abandoned reading 3 books before that. So I had tried reading 3 books and I had stopped reading all 3 of them. Let's go through each of them. So the first book I had tried and stopped reading was Hime, and this one had all of the furigana on the kanji, so the kanji readings, and it was from the same collection as the collection I got the Kimi no Na wa book in. And we'll talk more about this kind of collections for Japanese books which have the furigana and the kanji in another video in this series. The reason why I had stopped reading this book was not so much about the difficulty of it. It was difficult, of course, to start reading it, but it was more because I was not interested in the story. I distinctly remember reading, I think, 3 pages or 4 pages and thinking, oh, this seems and sounds very childish, and that's not what I want to be reading right now. Don't get me wrong, I do read some childish stuff sometimes, but this one in particular, because I didn't know anything about this character and I had no attachment to this character at the time, I was more interested in finding things that I would find interesting to read. So that's the first element. And actually I never ended up reading that book. The second book I had started reading was the first part of the first Harry Potter book, and this one I stopped reading it because I didn't realize it at the time, but I had gotten the wrong edition of the book in the wrong collection, which almost didn't have any furigana on the kanji, so at my level at the time it was impossible to read without the furigana. So I stopped reading after I think one page. I actually read the first Harry Potter book at the end of 2020 in October, so yeah, 1 year after. Then the third book was The Garden of Words by Shinkai Makoto, actually the same author as Kimi no Na wa. And this one I stopped reading it because I just realized that the language level was a bit higher than my level, like at least N2 more than N3, and at the time, like I told you in the first video of this series, I was not even at N3 level, I was at N4. I had just started out on my N3 level studies, so it was too high for me, and I abandoned reading that book after maybe 3 pages. So you see, right at the beginning, for different reasons, I had stopped reading these 3 books. I was just, on the lookout for something that was the most suitable for me, so I was not particularly discouraged. However, it was urgent for me to find something that would suit me because I really wanted to start reading. Alright, second question. How you choose your reads, comprehensible input or a bit more challenging for your level at the time? Right, so first of all, at the time, in 2019, I was living in Singapore still, and in Singapore, books in Japanese in general are much more available. There is the Japanese Kinokuniya bookstore, and so I simply went there physically to the kids section of the Kinokuniya in Singapore, and then I just looked for something interesting on the bookshelves, really. That was my process. I knew I had to look into the green section. I didn't know about the other colors at the time. If you know, you know, but otherwise I will explain all of that again in a future video in this series. But just know that I was looking for the green books, right? Like this. And that's when I found Kimi no Na wa. I recognized the cover. And because I had liked the movie, the anime movie, actually I liked it a lot. I think by that time I had probably watched it twice, so I was quite attached to the story, and I thought that this would be a perfect first read, again in comparison with the other books I had tried. This book, the Kimi no Na wa book, I had a special interest in, so I knew that I would be able to push through any difficulties that I would encounter while reading it, like more easily at least. And then I knew that it contained 100% of the furigana because I had looked it up, and at the time I also realized that I wanted to have something in original Japanese and not something translated to Japanese. So that was also part of my reasoning. So for all of these reasons, that's why I chose my first book. And honestly, I didn't think about it like for that long. It took me 5 minutes to decide, but then I committed to it, and because again, like I said, I knew the story and I knew I liked the story, in fact I loved the story, I knew that this was the one. This was the one for me. So there you have it. That's the answer to the question. So was I looking more for comprehensible input or for something more challenging? I think I was not specifically looking for something that contained comprehensible input, and I didn't mind the challenge. Even though I was not looking for a challenge specifically, I didn't mind it. I was more interested in the special interest element because I knew that I needed that to push through the obstacles. Next question. Hi, I want to know, how do you read the new kanji if found in the book? Right, so this is, I think, a very important question, so let's get it out of the way because I think a lot of Japanese learners, surprisingly, don't know about this, but let me explain. To be able to read kanji you don't know, so the kanji characters you don't know, you have a few different options, right? You can look for the kanji via their reading, if you have their reading, so the furigana on the kanji, because if you type in the reading inside the dictionary, you will be able to transform the letters or the kana, so the furigana, into the characters, and then you'll be able to look up the actual characters and what they mean. That's the first option you have. The second option is to look for each separate part of the kanji, and then once you find all of the different parts of the kanji, you will be able to form the full kanji and then look it up. And then the third option you have is to actually draw the kanji out yourself and then look it up, because it will come up and then you can look it up. So when I first started reading, even at the time, I had actually figured out that the best way for me, may not be the best for everyone, but for me, to look up kanji was to draw them and then look them up. Now, knowing that, I had actively looked for an app or a dictionary that would allow me to do that. There are two main resources you can use to do that. You have electronic dictionaries, which you can purchase. They are very expensive. They have a digital pencil, like an Apple Pencil. On some of them, you can draw on a little pad the kanji as you see them written, and then you can look them up. The easier way to do this is just to get an app on your tablet or your phone. The one I use and the one I have always used from the beginning is Yume. On the Yume app, you have this little pad, but then you can draw with your finger or with your Apple Pencil the kanji you encounter in the text and then look them up. So let me show you a little demonstration of that. Alright, here we go. So I open the Yume app, and when I click on the search bar, I can actually access the drawing pad right here, clicking here. And then if I draw out any kanji, so watashi in this case, it will come up right here. I click on it, it becomes searchable, and I can see the dictionary entry of that kanji. As simple as that, it took me less than a second. Next question by Jessica. I think I remember you using different colors to underline different parts. Could you explain it? Right, so we finally entered the main subject of this video today, which is how I actually read my first book. Yes, I did use different colors when I was reading my first book. So she was actually referring to that kind of page on my first book. I'm going to do a flip through of this right now for you guys. What happened there is that I actually used a specific color code right here to highlight the different things I didn't really understand. So for instance, if I found a new noun inside the text which I didn't know, I would highlight it, in this case in purple color. If I found a new adjective, I would highlight it in this reddish color. If I found a new verb, then I would highlight it in yellow. And so what happened is that at the very beginning, I didn't actually use that for the first few pages, but that's when I realized that I actually needed that. And from the first chapter, so not the prologue, but the first chapter, so you see the first few pages have nothing on them. And then from page 18, that's when I started using this method. So at the start, I was only doing that. I was only highlighting the words that, like I said, I didn't know when I read them. And then from, let's see, from page 31, I started writing the translations of the things I was looking up in the text. The idea behind this method was that, first of all, I was trying to recreate the same reading environment which I had found and used in the Satori Reader app, which I talked about extensively in the first video of this series. So if you're interested, please go and watch that. And in this app, basically every part of the sentence is clickable and you can know what each part of it is. So if you're looking up a noun, if you're looking up a grammar structure, if you're looking up a verb, an adjective, expressions, so on and so forth. And I think with that method, so with the colors, I was really trying to recreate that on the text on the page, because otherwise, as you saw, like it was at the beginning, when you're a beginner and you're starting to read, seeing a page like that filled with Japanese characters in black and white, it feels like very, very intimidating. And I distinctly remember the feeling, because not only was I feeling intimidated, but it would also give me headaches to try and decipher what was written on the pages. So my way to cope with that, to deal with the headaches and to deal with the struggle of deciphering the characters on my own this time, and without having the help of the translations like I would have on an interactive app. I used colors and I also wrote down the translations of the parts of the sentences I didn't know before reading. And you see, this went on for quite a while because we're already at page 47 here, and I was still using this method. And then from page 48, I stopped suddenly. So let me explain that very briefly while answering another question, which was about whether I was doing intensive or extensive reading at the start. Actually, you can get the answer to that question looking at my first book read, because you can see that whenever I was highlighting the words I didn't know and I was writing down the translations, what I was basically trying to do here was to understand everything. And that method is called intensive reading. I was using the intensive reading method up until the page 48 of that book, about 30% of it. And I suddenly stopped, and when I stopped, it simply means that I started using a different method to continue reading the book, the extensive reading method. Reading something extensively simply means that you are reading what's on the page, still looking at what you don't understand, especially when you are still a beginner and you can't really guess the meaning of things without looking them up. But at the same time, you're not trying to directly translate everything you read, so that's really what's called extensive reading. And so even within that first book, within my first book, I used both methods. And then you can see that from page 54, I suddenly started it again. And again, I remember this distinctly. It was because you see on that part here, suddenly there was a bunch of very difficult vocab words which I had to look up, and which, if I didn't write the translations of on the page, I would forget instantly right after looking them up, so I wouldn't be able to make sense of anything I was reading. So that's why I used the method again, highlighting a few words here, you see, 4 verbs and 2 adverbs, and then not highlighting anything again and simply writing down the translations. All of these pages had, for some reason, very difficult vocab suddenly, so I really had to write down the vocab. And then you see that after a while, so this is page 69, I started getting a bit more comfortable with what I was reading. So I was not writing down that many translations, and this was because I was starting to feel comfortable with a lot of the words I had looked up for the first 70 pages of this book, which were repeating themselves a lot and which I had finally digested. And so I could either understand them by myself, so I remembered their meaning, or I was still looking them up, but I didn't need to write down their translations anymore. So that's why you see that, it's getting less and less. And I'm only, except for some pages like this one, for example, where again, for some reason, some pages contain more difficult vocab than others. Other than that, I knew that, I was getting slowly more and more comfortable with my reading there, and also I had gotten used to how the author was writing, so his writing style, how he was, making his characters speak, and so all of that combined made me more and more comfortable with this read. And we are now coming on to the 93rd page. I was still writing down the translations, it was still difficult, so you can imagine, this was not asked, but I'm telling you guys that you can imagine this took me a while, okay? And like I told you at the beginning of this video today, it took me from October to end of January to read this book, so a few months, okay, to read only one book. And in fact, when reading again my Instagram post from 2021, I reminded myself of something I had forgotten, and it was that it took me 3 weeks to read the first 20 pages of this book, and then the next 20 pages, so from page 20 to page 40, took me another month. For the first part of this book, the first third of it, it took me literally a month and a half to read. And then as I kept on reading, I picked up speed, but still it took me another month and a half. In total about 3 months, which is extremely long. And oh my god, this page. Yeah, I remember this page. All of that were at the time very, very difficult words for me. I didn't know any of them. This was probably my first encounter with these words ever, and I'm happy I encountered them this way because, as you can see, I still remember. It really imprinted on my memory. So yes, it took me a long time, okay, many hours, more than I can count, and I didn't count my hours, so I don't know how many hours it actually took me during these 3 months. Another thing I do remember though, which I also want to tell you guys, is that I couldn't read for more than an hour at a time. At the time. Towards the end, I think the more I could manage was an hour and a half at a time. That was it. I couldn't read for a longer period of time because I would get the worst headaches trying to read again, trying to decipher the kanji and just making sense of written Japanese. So you must understand also that, you know, I was not focusing on that book and reading it for like 6 hours at a time every time I opened it. Not at all. I couldn't really manage more than an hour, and most of the time I wasn't reading for an hour. I was more reading for like 30 to 45 minutes maximum, and probably like twice or thrice a week, and that's it. And I did manage to go through it. Oh, and you can see here that we entered a new phase when I would not use my color coding anymore because it was taking me too much time to remember which color was which. So I was only highlighting the words in pink color, so I didn't distinguish between the words anymore with the colors, and only highlighting the words I would look up. So you see there weren't many anymore, or at least the words that I found crucial to understand so that I would make sense of the sentences. So this also answers one of your other questions, guys, which was how do you choose which words are worth looking up in the dictionary and which ones to just guess or let go of? Well, I can tell you that at the time, especially when I was using the extensive reading method, I would only look up the words that I found crucial, like I said, to make sense of the sentences and just to understand the general meaning. And the words that I didn't think were crucial for understanding, I wouldn't look up, or I would look up but I wouldn't write the translation of. And this is also answering another of your question, which was, did you note down new words as you read and look them up or guess their meaning? I did look up almost all the new words I would encounter for the first time, or which I had already encountered but didn't remember the meaning of, so I still had to look up to remember the meaning of. And then did I guess the meaning of any word? I couldn't guess the meaning of any word at the time. I was too much of a beginner. So no, I didn't guess the meaning of any word. I had to look up every word I would encounter and didn't know the meaning of. I think that when it comes to, you know, vocab and also grammar, so basically everything that is contained in a sentence and which you want to make sense of, especially when you start reading in your target language, the most important thing is just to feel it. Do you feel like you can make sense of it? What do you need to make sense of it? What do you need to look up? You need to ask yourself these questions and see what is the most useful for you to look up. Like, I really do think that it's a matter of feeling, and that at the end of the day you're the only one knowing whether or not you can trust what you understood, whether you can make sense of what you read. You're the only one to know that, so just trust yourself, you know, trust yourself, trust the process. It is true in this case, it is really true in this case, in the reading process, and especially when reading your first book in your target language, any target language, doesn't need to be Japanese. That's really the mindset you must have, trusting the process, trusting yourself. And actually, as we finish this book here and we turn on the last page, you can see I went up until the end. All of it's 252 pages, and that's the end of this book. And as we finish it, let's move on to the last part of this video and the last questions, which will all be related to mindset, motivation, and inner drive. Alright, another day, another look, and let's move on to the next question. How did you deal with the frustration at how ambiguous Japanese sentences can be sometimes? I think it's the biggest obstacle on my reading journey. First of all, I want to say that the frustration is real, the struggle is real. You're not the only one feeling the frustration. I definitely felt it. I know many other Japanese language learners who also felt that frustration you're speaking of. And yes, Japanese is very ambiguous, and yes, you must have a very long digestion phase with the language to only start making sense of it in the sentence structure mostly, and also in how the language is written. It is very frustrating, and at the beginning it is very ambiguous. And I want to tell you that yes, it is ambiguous, but then it is ambiguous until it's not anymore. So you will definitely have at some point in your learning, if you keep being consistent and if you keep studying the language on the side and studying especially grammar, really making a focus on grammar, you will definitely go over this ambiguity phase that you're experiencing. And I can only tell you that because I went through it, and I also had these doubts myself on whether or not I would ever get past this struggling phase with understanding the language, and I did. And I know for a fact that this was primarily because I focused on grammar and really understanding the sentence structure, and also because I immersed myself in the language a lot more than I actually actively studied the language. So a focused study on grammar combined with an intensive immersion practice led me to go over this ambiguity phase. And the last thing I want to tell you here is that how I dealt with the frustration was by knowing that I would eventually get over it and get through it. So I had this faith that in any case, because I was so intent on understanding this language, I had some moments of doubts, but most of the time I had no doubt that I would get there. And this faith in myself, faith in the process, really took me by the hand. I took myself by the hand to get through this. That's how I dealt with it. And it was ambiguous until it wasn't anymore. Just to tell you also how long it took me for me to not feel this ambiguity anymore in the sentences. I want to say that for the first year and a half at least studying the language, I still struggled with this ambiguity you speak of. It took me 1 year and a half of intense studying combined with intense immersion practice. Next question. How did you keep on reading even though you did not understand 100% of the contents? A very good question. I want to start by saying that I did not understand 100% of the contents I was reading in Japanese until probably 3 years of reading practice. I don't want to scare you guys, but it is the truth, and I'm here to tell you the truth of what I experienced. Up until 3 years of me actively studying the language and immersing in the language, I did not understand 100% of the contents. I think my understanding went up with time, of course. So at the start when I was reading, I could make sense of maybe 25 to 30% of what I was reading, and then as I went on and as the years went by as well, and of course depending on the material I was reading, I could understand more and more, and then the 25% became 50%, and then it became 65, and then 75, and then 85. 100% of understanding is still, even now, it is still difficult. I just wanted to say that right from the start because I don't want you guys to have unrealistic expectations towards this. You will definitely struggle with understanding what you read for a long time, and that's perfectly normal. And I think the reason why I kept on reading there was, first of all, that, like I said many times already, now I think you get the point, reading in Japanese and becoming able to read in Japanese by myself, being comfortable with reading in general in Japanese was and still is my foremost goal with learning the language. I had this inner motivation, this inner drive that really took me by the hand and forced me to overlook any struggle I had because I was intent on succeeding. I wanted to succeed so much. I kept on reading even though I understood 25% of what I was reading because I wanted to understand more and more, and because I knew that the only way I would get there was by reading. So it didn't matter how much I would understand of the text. It didn't matter whether what I was reading was above my level or below my level. I did not care that much because my only goal was to read. Everything else was beside the point almost. And now let's move on to the last question of this video. How is it enjoyable if it's difficult to understand? Just like one of the prior questions, how do you deal with the frustration of the ambiguity of the language? This is the same answer that I'm going to give you. It is not enjoyable to read in your target language, any target language, until someday it becomes enjoyable. Now, how did I know then that it would become enjoyable at some point, and how did I know then that I would stop struggling at some point and that everything would be better at some point? It was primarily because I had gone through the same process with reading in English many years before that, probably 10 years before that. When I was still a teenager, I read my first book in English, and let me tell you, that was extremely overwhelming and very difficult, and it shattered a lot of my beliefs about my level in English. Really, I was confronted to the truth of what my level was at that time. And then from that first book, I went on to read many more books in English over the years. And that's how I became comfortable with reading in English and how it became enjoyable. So I had this prior experience. I knew that this was possible. I had done it before in a second language. I wanted to believe that it was no different for Japanese, that the process I had gone through with English was the exact same I would go through with Japanese. And guess what? It worked. I don't know whether you can compare the two. I didn't care. I still don't care. What matters was what I believed at the time and what I still believe, because it helped me become my own coach in a way, and I always had my own voice in my head telling me it is difficult, you're not enjoying any of it, you are struggling, the struggle is real, but you will get there. Push through, you will get there, because there is no other choice. I was not giving myself any other choice. I wanted to become able to read in Japanese. Reading in Japanese for me didn't become enjoyable until probably the second year. The first year, at least, in 2020, it was not enjoyable. I cannot call this an enjoyable process. It was still very difficult. At least the first 10 books were very difficult for me, and the process of reading them was painful, very painful. But yeah, I think it became enjoyable from the second year of reading immersion in Japanese. But you know what, guys? I think we've covered a lot in today's video already, so all of that and you know how I continued with my reading journey in Japanese will be the subject, the theme of the next video that I will produce in this series. So I will stop here for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, that it was insightful. As usual, don't forget to leave comments down below if you want to tell me anything, if you want to ask me more questions based on what I told you today, guys. Let's keep the conversation going as always, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye! Mata ne!